All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
And welcome back to the X Zone, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell, and we're coming to you live and around the world from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, on the X Zone Broadcast Network and the Talkstar Radio Network, as well as our affiliates worldwide across Canada, the United States, Central America, the Caribbean, South America, the Pacific Rim, Asia, India, Africa, Europe. The X Zone Nation is worldwide. My email address is xzone@xzoneradiotv.com, on MSN Messenger, xzoneradiotv@hotmail.com, and our website, www.xzoneradiotv.com. My guest this hour, X Zone Nation, is Dr. PJShield, and Peter's known for his World of the Unexplained Mysteries radio segments that have been heard across Australia and Europe and Asia for over 30 years. Now, here's just some of the many media credits that this fine gentleman has to his credit. Daily television shows including Vegas Mysteries and My Special Guest, Radio KLAV, 1230 AM in Las Vegas, Nevada. Let me see, Radio 2UE in Sydney, Radio 2WS in Sydney, Radio 4BH in Brisbane, Channel 9 TV in Sydney, Channel 10 TV in Perth, and that's just some of his very many media credits. We're very happy to have Dr. PJShield as our guest this hour, and Dr. Shield, welcome to the X Zone. How are you, sir?
Well, thank you, Rob. It's absolutely wonderful to be back in Canada, even if it's only metaphysically.
Metaphysically, but you and I were talking prior to going on air that you were actually born and raised, or you lived for a number of years in Brantford, Ontario, which is about 10 miles from where our studios are right now.
Absolutely. I started my life in broadcasting with CKPC in Brantford and with the Brantford Expositor newspaper. I don't know if they're both still there.
They are both still there, sir, and they are both doing very well. Where did your interest in the mysteries of the world come from, Peter?
Well, it's interesting, Rob. I started life as a photojournalist, originally with the Brantford Expositor, and then I went and joined Associated Press. And AP sent me out to the Middle East, to the island of Malta, to cover the then turmoil that was going on between the Maltese government and the British government over the dockyards. This was back in the early 50s. During that period of time, I was assigned by the Maltese government to accompany a number of high-profile visitors, people like Lord Snowden, Anthony Armstrong-Jones, who came to the island, and a visiting team from Cambridge University's Archaeological Department, headed by a gentleman called Dr. David Trump, who was their senior archaeologist at the time. And David was kind enough to invite me to take over the archaeological photography for their division, and I spent the next 5 years photographing artifacts in museums, in churches, underground and overground on the island. And that really turned into a love of archaeology. And I returned then with David to Cambridge in England, and was another 4 years in Cambridge before jotting off to Ireland and then to Australia.
You certainly have been traveling over your years as a photojournalist, and looking at your media credits: Sydney, Australia; Brisbane, Perth, Las Vegas, Australia. Where haven't you been on your quest?
Well, I've lived in 25 countries around the world. It was rather interesting. In Australia, I was called by a radio station, 2WS, who wanted to do some 3-minute segments on mysteries of the world. And I said, that's impossible. You can't talk about the Bermuda Triangle or flying saucers or things that go bump in the night in 3 minutes. But anyway, they sent me away to do my homework, and it evolved into a 47-station, 20-year syndication of those 3-minute segments.
Dr. Shield, please stand by, sir. You and I have to take our first 2-minute commercial break. Exonation this hour. Dr. Peter Shield is our special guest, and his website is www.PJShield.com. That's PJShield.com. In the next hour, we're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin, as Dr. Peter Shield and I continue here in the X Zone from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, about 10 miles away from Brantford, Ontario, live and around the world on the Talkstar Radio Network and X Zone Broadcast Network. Don't go away. We'll be back right after this 2-minute commercial break. The new nonfiction book, Razor of Madness, is similar to cult movies like Clockwork Orange, Dragon's Tattoo, or The Other Side of Hell. Wayne Morin Jr. and Thomas Lee Howell expose widespread and systematic deficiencies in this thought-provoking tell-all novel. Mind control rages among scholars in law schools. Human rights are ignored while thought reform and mental manipulation are accepted practices used as behavior modification. Dr. Louis Jolyon West comes to mind. Media and public scrutiny shows that United States mental hospitals are in fact destructive murder industries. Razor of Madness expose novel details this epidemic through an in-depth professional and personal investigation. For decades there has been a revolving door policy that still releases killers and pedophiles back into society. The maestro of mind control continues to haunt America to this very day. Razor of Madness is available in paperback or as a downloadable ebook at Amazon.com. Welcome back to the X Zone. Dr. Peter Shield is with me, and Peter, you and I are going to be discussing the Shroud of Turin. Would you like to set up this clip that we're going to be listening to for our listeners?
Well, yes. The Shroud has been very much a part of my life, Rob, for, well, really the last 20-odd years. In 1987, I was hosting a 2-hour radio show, very similar to your own, on 2CH in Sydney, and my producer came to me one day and said, "What do you know about the Shroud of Turin?" And I said, "Well, I know it exists, but I know very little about it." And it appeared we'd had a request from a listener that wanted to know more about the Shroud. And so we set up a program. Actually, it coincided with Easter. And my producer at the time, Elizabeth, was able to get in touch with the author of a book, a gentleman by the name of Rex Morgan in Sydney, Australia, who'd written a number of books on the Shroud. And he was kind enough to put me in touch with 7 members of what were known as the STIRP group. The STIRP stands for the Search for, or an investigative study, I should say, into the Shroud of Turin. The STIRP group went to Turin in 1977 and carried out very extensive tests on the Shroud, not to prove whether or not it was a religious artifact, not to prove whether or not it was the burial cloth, as many Christians believe, of Christ, but much more importantly, how, from a scientific point of view, the actual image got on the cloth. And interestingly enough, pardon me, Rod, my throat's going.
Okay, sir.
Let me take a quick sip.
Sure.
Interestingly enough, to this day, we still do not have an answer as to how that actual negative image, because anybody who is familiar with the shroud will know that the image on the shroud, which quite frankly is remarkable in itself. It's a 6-foot man, exactly described as the biblical description of Christ, but most importantly, it's in negative. It's a reverse picture of the face and body of a 6-foot man been crucified.
All right, Peter, what we're going to do is we're going to play the clip right now, and then you and I will come back and we'll discuss it. This is a clip, Exonation, with Dr. Peter Shield interviewing Dr. Adler, talking about the Shroud of Turin.
Peter J. Shield's World of Unexplained Mysteries continues.
Dr. Alan Adler, good morning to you.
Good morning.
We, in fact, have been discussing with one or two of the experts involved in the 1978 investigation of the Shroud, the various difficulties and problems. I understand, sir, that you were very largely responsible for the identification of blood on the Shroud.
That's correct.
I'd be most interested, sir, to hear your comments, particularly in view of conversations we had earlier today with Dr. Walter McCrone, who was quite emphatic that it was just nothing more than a painting.
Well, what we did was to run not just one test for blood, but a variety of tests for blood. We used one of the oldest known tests for blood forensically, which is to see if one can generate the compound that produces the color in blood. That is a compound that's called a porphyrin. It's the same stuff that makes grass green. Chlorophyll is a porphyrin-related structure, and the heme in blood is a porphyrin-related structure. It's a very sensitive test for blood. We ran that. We got that. We also were able to get a number of other tests for blood. But also, most importantly, we've got an immunological test for blood. And not only have we gotten them, but an Italian investigator by the name of Bologna has independently confirmed our results and also got an immunological test for blood. So we feel pretty certain that the blood is blood.
Right. I mentioned in my brief chat with Ian Wilson in the UK the fact that we, of course, have had quite a controversial time over here recently, of course, with the Lindy Chamberlain case that you've no doubt read about, relating to the possible taking of a child by a dingo. And, of course, the blood tests played a very real part in the original conviction of Lindy. Of course, the trial is still going on, so we can't say much about it. But there we were dealing only with blood that was 5 or 6 years old. In this case, we're talking, well, at the very minimum, many hundreds of years.
Well, that's why some of the tests that we ran are more indicative than some of the tests that people routinely run. Some of the tests that people run for blood depend on the blood being fresh. The test that I ran where we detected the so-called porphyrin fluorescence is a blood that does not depend on the blood being fresh. It is now being used more and more for people for the archaeometric detection of blood. We've actually shown you can actually demonstrate 10,000-year-old blood is blood with this particular test, which many of the more recent tests will not. The immunological tests, we got positive results, is all I can say. On the other hand, people have also gotten immunological results on blood from tomb samples that would have been equally as old, if not older. So it's surprising to see an immunological test on a sample level. But on the other hand, people have done the same thing with older material.
Forgive me asking, sir, but obviously a man of your faith, how did you become involved with the Shroud in the first place?
I made a mistake of talking to somebody on the phone like I'm doing.
You've been involved with the investigation, sir, for some years now.
Yeah, well, actually I work in the field of porphyrin, so detecting blood this way is something that's not new to me. And I had done it in the past before working on the Shroud in some sticky blood cases. And so a person actually asked me, would I detect some blood for him on a piece of cloth this way? Then he told me it was the Shroud of Turin. So actually, it was John Heller that did that.
Right.
John Heller that got me roped into this.
How major a part has it played in your life since you became involved, sir?
It chewed up all of my free time.
Are you hopeful of being there in 1988 when they carry out the carbon-14 process?
I certainly hope so.
What do you think they'll achieve with that process, sir?
Well, it'll certainly tell us, what the date of the cloth is. It won't tell us what the date of the image is.
Right.
It'll certainly tell us the date of the cloth. And if the cloth dates to, a first-century cloth, well, then it certainly continues to add to the arguments that several of us have been using that it's not a 14th century artist.
Right.
I'm sure people like Walter McCrum will say he used the first-century cloth.
Yes.
But, there are only so many of these ad hoc hypotheses you can use before it simply becomes more reasonable to accept the fact this isn't a 14th century artistic work.
How, sir, if you had to, if you were pinned down, would you explain the image on the cloth?
Well, honestly, at this point, that's the one thing we can't do.
Right.
We think we know what the chemistry of the image is. We think we know what the chemistry of the blood is. We think that makes sense in terms of what one would expect in pathological processes for someone who was scourged and crucified. But the interesting thing is, with all the work that we've done on it, we still can't suggest a simple process by which the image and the blood could have been put on the cloth by the same process. We now feel quite strongly that the blood got in it by being in contact with a wounded body. But it's quite clear that the image had to go on there by a different process. And we really don't know how to explain that at this point.
Your findings would indicate that the blood could not have been smeared on the cloth.
No, I mean, the sort of thing we see, it looks like, at this point, it looks to us, what we're actually seeing is not whole blood, but the exudate from blood clots. So, there had to be enough time for this blood to have clotted on this individual before the cloth came in contact with it. And that seems most consistent with the forensic chemistry, with the forensic biology, with the medical findings, and with the chemistry that we've done.
The three-dimensional image that appears on the cloth, did that impress you in any way?
It sure does, because that's the thing we can't explain in a simple way.
Right.
We don't have any simple process that we've been able to find that would explain why that image is the particular type of image that we see.
Right.
Definitely not a contact image.
In hindsight, looking back on the 1978 investigation, is there anything that you feel perhaps was overlooked at that time, any particular test that could have been performed at that time that perhaps should be looked at in the future?
Well, there's certainly tests that should be done now, but, one has to realize the first time somebody does a study, you make the best guesses you can, you go in and you try to test those. And, of course, when you get through with a whole bunch of tests, you find out, gee, we should have done this, we should have done that.
Yes.
Actually, the testing was done in 78. It was really a very good set of tests. People made the best guesses they could, designed the best experiments they could, design on the basis of that. And went in and really established a lot of things. It's very important that we established it wasn't a painting, because, of course, a lot of the tests were designed to find out what kind of a painting was it.
Right.
People, in fact, did go in there with, in fact, the opinion that it probably was a painting. The idea that anybody went in there going to prove it wasn't a painting is bizarre, because all one has to do is look at the tests that were carried out, and it's clear we were trying to find what kind of a painting it was. So it's quite a shock to find out, in fact, that the data, in fact, indicates that it isn't a painting. And so, of course, what we need to do now is go back and look at tests now to tell us more about the kinds of things we did find. We think it's some sort of an oxidation process. We want to explore that further. We'd like to get further tests that the blood is blood, and the kinds of, abnormalities in the blood chemistry to support some of the forensics.
All right, Exonation, we're going to hold this interview right here. There's about 3 minutes left on this interview with our guest of this hour, Dr. PJShield and Dr. Alan Adler, talking about the Shroud of Turin. Then after the interview, Dr. Shield will be joining me to talk about the interview and to give us any updates on the investigation into the Shroud of Turin. My name is Rob McConnell, and this is the X-Zone on the all-new X-Zone Broadcast Network and the Talkstar Radio Network. My email is xzone@xzoneradiotv.com, on MSN Messenger, xzoneradiotv@hotmail.com, and our website, www.xzoneradiotv.com. For more information on Dr. Peter Shield, visit his website, www.PJShield.com. That's www.PJShield.com. Dr. Shield and I return on the other side of this break with the news as we continue from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away. If you enjoy reading a good mystery with a touch of the paranormal, then you'll love From Out of the Woodwork by William S. Peckham. Sean Kennedy, a Toronto contractor, buys derelict houses, guts them, and turns them into multi-family dwellings. When Sean buys 29 Livery Lane, a century house in ruins, and starts the renovation, the house fights back. He is visited by ghosts of owners past. His visions are triggered by touching an oak mantle, reading a faded letter, opening an old locket, or opening a brand new casket in the basement. These visions will take you on a trip across southern Ontario from Niagara Falls to Toronto to Kingston. From Out of the Woodwork is now available in paperback and on your favorite electronic reader. To order your copy of From Out of the Woodwork, go to www.williamspeckham.com. That's www.williamspeckham.com.
Now, I think I know why it sounded so strange on the telephone. Well, it's hard when you discover what keeps you going, keeps you all alone. I dream so
So there are a lot of things we'd like to do in a second round of testing. One, of course, is to also date the cloth.
Right.
All these things in the long run will help us to establish that it's not a forgery. You see, one of the things we can't prove is that it's authentic, not by science. We don't have any tests for authenticity. We only have tests for disauthenticity. And so if we keep doing all of these tests and we keep finding that we don't prove it's disauthentic, then it's up to the historians, the theologians, the anthropology and the archaeology types to decide what they want to do with the data. Because clearly then the scientific data will not be inconsistent with, in fact, this being Christ's burial shroud. And that's really the best the science can ever say.
Walter McCrone was quite specific in my discussions with him today that paint pigment was only to be found on the actual image itself.
Well, we disagree with that.
Right.
Certainly you see the spectroscopy that was done, the ultraviolet and the infrared spectroscopy, which are stuff on the whole cloth, not just looking at a sample from it, are not in agreement with that. And he's never answered that point.
Right.
The attitude is those studies must just be wrong.
Right.
I mean, you know, you can't throw away other people's data because you don't agree with it. We, in fact, in the peer-reviewed literature have shown why we think our data is different from his.
Right.
We've shown why we think his interpretations are not correct. He's never done us the courtesy of doing the same. He's not shown why our measurements would be in error. He just says we did it wrong. That's not science. I'm sorry.
If the carbon dating process shows the cloth to be relatively recent, where do we go from there?
Well, then clearly it's not Christ's cloth. And then maybe people let us do, the kind of testing we do to find out what it really is all about.
Yes.
You see, the fact that it might be a real religious artifact means we've been very limited in the amount of study time, sampling, and the things we've been able to do. If it could be definitely established that it isn't, there still remains the intriguing problem. No matter whose cloth it is, how did that image get on there?
Of course. Of course.
Because, in our opinion, it's not a painting. We'd like to find out what is it and how did it happen. And so that would remain a scientific problem no matter whose cloth it is, and a very interesting one.
Well, thank you so very much for your time today. It's been most enjoyable talking with you, and certainly I know Rex has asked me to extend his best wishes to you in the United States.
Please send my best to Rex, and also send my best wishes to his daughter, who I understand is getting married this spring.
Well, certainly I'll do that. Thank you so much, Dr. Alan Adler.
You're welcome.
My guest this hour is Dr. Peter Shield, who interviewed Dr. Alan Adler going back, I believe it was prior to 1988. And Peter, in relation to the other mysteries that you have investigated, where does the Shroud rate?
Well, absolutely number one, Rob. It's there is nothing to compare with it in the world of unexplained mysteries. I've spent a lot of time, as in fact your good self, talking with people around the world on every aspect of every conceivable type of mystery. What immediately comes to mind are things like Tutankhamun and the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs,
yes,
which I've done many programs on, and I'm sure you have too. Yet all of that can be, put down to media hype. But if you look at the case of the Shroud of Turin, and in my book, which is called In the Image of His God, which was published at the Shroud Convention last year, I make the point that over 29 people have mysteriously died who were associated over the years with the Shroud. And by the way, that includes Dr. Alan Adler, the gentleman you just heard, and the gentleman we were referring to, Dr. Walter McCrone, who was the one dissenting voice of the group that went to look at the Shroud. So unquestionably number one as the greatest unexplained mystery in the world today.
Peter, what makes the Shroud so special? Is it simply the religious implications?
Well, things. First of all, the fact that we cannot explain the image, and if in fact it does turn out to be what many Christians believe it to be, that is the cloth in which Jesus of Nazareth was wrapped at the time of the crucifixion, then of course it is the only image that we have of Christ, and more importantly, from both from a religious and an archaeological point of view, it becomes one of the most sacred documents in the world.
Now, Peter, what has the most recent scientific investigation that has been carried out since you had the interview with Dr. Adler found or discovered about the Shroud?
Well, of course, that was 20 years ago. Now, in 1988, following that interview, the Shroud was subjected to carbon dating, which most people are aware of. And 4 pieces of the Shroud were removed and sent to different universities around the world. Those universities unanimously came back with a date which, according to their theory, showed this to be a 14th century cloth. They dated it somewhere between 1200 and 1300. If in fact that were true, it couldn't, of course, have been the burial shroud of Christ. But a few years ago, a gentleman by the name of Ray Rogers at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in the United States went back in and did some further investigation into the actual pieces of cloth that were carbon dated. And of course, carbon dating itself is not the most reliable source of dating an object, though at the moment it's the best that we have. But they discovered that the actual piece of material that was carbon dated, that was actually removed from the cloth, wasn't in fact linen, which is what the cloth is made of, what the shroud is made of, but was in fact a piece of cotton. And it's firmly believed now by the scientific community and confirmed by the Vatican that the piece of cloth was cotton and was more than likely a piece of repair material that was put on there way back in the 1500s after the shroud was subjected to a fire in the cathedral.
Dr. Peter Shield is our special guest. His website is www.PJShield.com, and he's the author of In the Image of His God. And now, where does your book, In the Image of His God, tie into the Shroud of Turin, Peter?
Well, I went back to the island where I did my archaeological work about 5 or 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. And in the course of rummaging around in museums and what have you, I amazingly discovered a replica shroud of Turin. Over 37 replicas were made that we know of that are spread across Europe. And generally, these were made by laying a piece of material on the actual shroud itself and then transferring the image, and then it was framed and put on exhibition. The one I discovered in Malta, which dated back to the 1500s, was actually a present to the Maltese people by the then King of France. But more importantly, it's caused a thought to occur in my tiny little mind. What would have happened if the Vatican had actually switched shrouds? If the one that actually went for carbon dating, because at this time we did a discrepancy in the material, what if the Vatican had actually switched the two shrouds and replaced the Shroud of Turin with actually one that was created by Leonardo da Vinci and painted by the great master many, many years ago? And the book is a historic fiction. All the facts are accurate as to the history of the shroud, the people who have died, and everything to do with it. But it's tied into this fictitious plot of the shroud being smuggled out of Italy and concealed and hidden on the island of Malta.
Tell me, in your professional opinion as a person who has investigated the Shroud of Turin many years and have spoken to people, and based on your book, In the Image of His God, what do you believe that the Shroud of Turin actually is?
Well, I reiterate what Dr. Alan Adler said, bless his heart. There is no proof for authenticity. There's only proof for disauthenticity. We can disprove that it was the burial cloth of Christ. Mm-hmm. We can't check the DNA. We've got blood, but we don't have a sample of Christ's DNA. So we can't identify the fact that it was actually Christ's burial shroud. But let me give you just some quick facts. Sure. First of all, the man was naked. He was 6 foot tall. He wore a beard and shoulder-length hair. He had an enlarged chest from trying to breathe. Now, all this is based on the cloth. He had been beaten with a Roman flagrum, the whip that the Romans used, a very cruel, torturous punishment. He had puncture marks on his skull. He had bled whilst upright. He had suffered most of the wounds while alive, and yet the wound on the side, according to the shroud, had no swelling, indicating that the wound happened after the individual had died. Now, if you recall the biblical account, one of the Roman guards thrust a spear into Christ's side to determine whether or not he was still alive. So those are just some of the clues. There is dirt on the knees on the image on the shroud, and dirt on the tip of the nose reported to contain minerals from the Palestinian region. The blood smears on the upper shoulder are thought to be microscopic oak wood remains, and the pollen that was found on the shroud can be only found in Jerusalem. So there's an enormous amount of evidence to support the biblical story as we understand it of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth.
What, in your opinion, Peter, is the second most intriguing investigation that you carried out for your radio audience?
What, in terms of the Shroud, or you mean in terms of everything?
In terms of everything.
Well, again, the Shroud would have to have been the most incredible thing that we discussed, because we were able to go into it with in such depth with so many recognized scientific authorities. You rarely get that opportunity with any of the other mysteries that we encounter from time to time. We know in cases like the Bermuda Triangle and situations like that, that there's documentary evidence that the ships and planes actually went missing. But we also know that the coast of Florida is renowned for hijacking, and that the Coast Guard there report that 99% of the mysterious disappearances that happen on the coast of Florida are probably based on drug trafficking incidents that occur off the coast. And this is equally true of so many of the mysteries which we get to investigate over the years.
What is your opinion, and what have your investigations turned up on the UFO phenomenon that is worldwide?
Well, of course, the UFOs, I'm always so critical of our alien friends because they refuse to appear where I can see them. I read all these amazing reports. I fly in aircraft all around the world, but yet I have to encounter anything. One of the most interesting subjects, and perhaps we might do a program on this at some stage in the future, Rob, if you're so disposed, is the possible intervention by aliens on archaeological sites. I'm privileged to lecture on the cruise lines, and my favorite lecture, or certainly the one that my guests and my audiences enjoy most, is one that pertains to the possible intervention of aliens into the construction of things like the pyramids and a lot of the archaeological sites around the world, which we have no explanation for.
How about the myth of the end of the world, or the catastrophes that are being talked about by members of what I call the woo-woo crowd when it comes to December the 21st, 2012?
The Mayan calendar you're referring to?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Well, again, I was, funnily enough, as recently as yesterday, watching a very good documentary on just that subject. And one of the chief commentators made the comment, and I thought it was rather interesting, that there is absolutely no documentary evidence anywhere, and no mention anywhere in any of the Mayan documentations or scriptures, for want of a better word, that relate to a disaster taking place in 2012.
Peter, stand by. You and I have to take our final break. Dr. Peter Shield is our special guest, Exonation, www.PJShield.com. And he is the author of a book that, if you're into this kind of stuff that we've been talking about, I guarantee you'll enjoy this book. It's entitled In the Image of His God. Once again, that's www.PJShield.com. We'll be back on the other side of this commercial break as we continue here in the X Zone from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. A witch doctor's power and his ancient tribal ways cruelly collide with the force and authority of modern Africa. Africa is viewed through myriad eyes. You will never forget these characters. A young girl forced to endure a painful, cruel, and antiquated tribal custom. The sole survivor of a vicious tribal massacre. A nun who endures physical assault that compels her to question her faith. A deprived, disadvantaged schoolgirl who is infected with HIV. The translucent soul of a murdered friend. Welcome to Africa's Unfinished Symphony. While the tale of South Africa in the wake of World War II is riveting, violent, and cruel, it is also brimming with stories of kindness, compassion, and courage. Africa's Unfinished Symphony highlights commanding characters who not only bring haunting racial clashes to life, but also convey the intense conflicts that existed between archaic customs and modern influences. You will be captivated as you follow the convoluted path of Farida, of the ancients battling to become Bertha of the modern world. But are the outcomes of her struggle the best results for her and her beloved Africa? Africa's Unfinished Symphony will immerse you in historic African themes that will jolt you out of complacency and into compassion. For more information on how you can get your very own copy of Africa's Unfinished Symphony, visit www.luciamann.com. That's www.luciamann.com. Dr. Peter Shield is our special guest, www.PJShield.com. That's www.PJShield.com, and the name of his book is In the Image of His God. You know, Peter, that's one thing that's always baffled me when it comes to the UFO phenomenon is why don't they just land? You know, why are they being so secretive? What do they have to hide? Like, if they're really there, for God's sake, Ottawa, land. Washington, land. London, England, land. Moscow, land. But you know what? I have a theory, and I'd like to put this past you. I believe that the UFO conspiracy is not being committed by the government or the Vatican. I believe that the UFO conspiracy theory is being perpetrated and maintained by the UFO community for as long as...
By the media.
Well, no, I wouldn't say the media. I say the people who claim to be UFO investigators, because as long as there is this conspiracy theory in place, they can say what they want without providing any evidence to the contrary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Are you familiar with the time dilation theory?
No, I'm not.
Okay. It goes back to basically Einstein came up with a theory which says that if we travel through speed at speeds in excess of the speed of light, or even close to the speed of light, the rate with which our body deteriorates slows down so significantly that if we left Earth today, going by the fastest possible conceived means available to us today, it would take us over 1 million years to reach our nearest inhabited planet, that being Alpha Centauri. And we believe now that planet B of the 3-star configuration is actually capable of sustaining life. If you've made that kind of journey, in support of your comment a moment ago, you sure as hell are just not going to land in some wheat field and pluck a hair out of some maiden's head and then fly back for another 1 million years.
You know, and once again, we talk about cattle mutilation. Like, why not take the whole cow? Why would, if you're doing something that is so mysterious, why would you just leave the carcass there? Take the carcass somewhere and dump it in the middle of the ocean where nobody finds it. You know, their entire scenarios make no sense.
Or barbecue it. What the hell?
Exactly. Where's the beef? Peter, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been a great pleasure. I look forward to the next time you and I meet here in the X Zone. Give our listeners your website one more time and tell them where they can get a copy of your book.
Okay, and I will. And I just want to remind everybody that the Shroud does go on show for the first time in many, many years. It wasn't scheduled to be seen until the year 2025. but in view of the new evidence, the Pope has agreed it will go on show this year, April 10th to May 23rd, but all the details are on the website. My book, and as you have been so gracious to promote, is available on my website. That's PJShield.com. My main website is worldofunexplainedmysteries.com, but that's a lot to remember. If you go to PJShield.com, you can not only acquire any one of my books, but you can also find links to all the other websites.
Peter, thank you very much for joining us. Great talking to you. And like I said, I look forward to the next time you and I meet here in the X Zone. When we come back from this...
Thanks.
All right, when we come back from this news break, we'll be speaking to... You ready for this? Got your pens and paper? All righty. Lori Jacobson is going to be joining us. That's coming up next here in the X Zone. After all, this is truly a place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard here on the X Zone Broadcast Network and Talkstar. We'll be back after the news break. Don't go away.